Today I'm going to tell you about my favorite book I read this year, which came completely out of nowhere and blew my freaking mind. I'm going to tell you about 10 award-winning books, and I'm going to help you pick which book you're going to read next. And we're going to do it with this drawn-out view, because looking at the beautiful autumn Vermont foliage is so much nicer than looking at my face. Sword of Kaigen by Email Wong is about a village of waterbending samurai in a world which already has planes and cell phones and electricity and stuff like that. This village is the last holdout of the traditional kind of cultural ways of doing things. It holds on to the past while the rest of the world has moved on beyond them. It's got enthralling fight scenes with characters taking on freaking tornadoes. It's got swordsmen clashing with whips of fire and ice. It's got empires at war. It's got warriors who can become the mountain. It has everything. And yet, for how kind of tropey, how anime all of this sounds, it was surprisingly very mature. And I don't use anime as a bad thing there. It is exciting to read. It's more that I came to this book with the expectations, which very much turned out to be incorrect. Just as much as Sword of Kaigen was fun to read, this is about motherhood. It is about a woman's relationship with her body within that. And there's an interesting parallel, given these, samurai characters, about their relationship with their body. They are made to be weapons. Sword of Kaigen is primarily about a woman inside a marriage that she did not really choose, and all of the characters in this story were viscerally real to me. And because of that depth, it meant that all of this really cool, fun stuff, which is really awesome to read, it meant that really meant something. And that's all we can hope for as writers. Not that just we write something which is cool, but something which is meaningful, something which people come to and that they walk away different from. I told you this video was about 10 award-winning books, and that doesn't mean that I liked all of them, but it does mean that somebody liked all of them. Because a while back, I was invited to be a judge for the SPIFBOs, the Self-Published Fantasy Book Awards, and the task being to rank these 10 books against each other. They're all the winners of their respective years. Now, despite my praise for Sword of Kaigen, it actually only comes in at number 2. By the end of this video, I hope you have an idea of which one you might want to read, but to help you out, I've created a flowchart to help you decide, but we will get to that. I need to praise Kaigen's world building for a second. I absolutely bought into it. It is a fully realized world. There's also a really interesting linguistic element to this story, because a lot of the characters are speaking in a second language, not their first native language. And often I find it a little bit awkward when, people just keep on swapping out made-up language terms when the characters are still very much clearly speaking English on the page, but it really worked here because of that interesting linguistic context which is in the book itself. On a narrative level, structurally, Kaigen actually does something really interesting. It doesn't feel like it's got a very, conventional 3-act structure. It instead is basically divided into 2 parts. You've got this first half, which is, about the training and their abilities and kind of a school element and the family dynamic between the 3 kind of key characters. And then around the halfway point, this kind of big battle starts, and it goes for most of the rest of the book. Now, oftentimes that gets really tiring and repetitive, but Kaigen, it just does not feel that way. It is constantly changing and evolving in interesting ways, and evolving with the characters themselves. There are also these little moments of kind of like third-person omniscient, where kind of like flash forwards or flashbacks, which remind you that there is something greater at play in this story, which are really well done. If you want something which is both exciting and meaningful, I can't really recommend Sword of Kaigen more than that. Murder at Spindle Manor is an Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes Victorian murder mystery novel with a fantastical twist. Our protagonist is Isabeau, a Witcher-esque character who is charged with rooting out the Doppelworm, a shapeshifter from amongst a colourful cast of suspects, any of whom, of course, could be the Doppelworm themselves. And let's just be straight up, this is a fantastic idea, wonderful concept, brilliant idea, the perfect merging of 2 things which people absolutely love and that I haven't seen done before. And yet, despite that, it unfortunately does come in quite resoundingly at number 10 out of the list for me. There are a few reasons for this. The first amongst them being that a lot of the characters, the suspects, kind of blurred together in my mind. And hi. Which is a problem for a book like a light murder mystery novel, because a lot of the interest comes from just watching this quirky, weird cast of characters interact with each other, rather than from, you know, like, getting deeply invested in them and watching them change and evolve and crying at the end. The interest comes from having this natural tension and conflict from this extreme cast of characters just existing from them talking to each other and being in the same room. And I'm not sure I got that in the way that I would have hoped here. The second is that the writing was a little bit weak in some areas, especially in the dialogue. I found it a little bit gimmicky. Like, there's a line where Isabeau's talking to a character and she says, "You are most certainly not non-verbal," which according to the conventional rules of grammar means you must be verbal. This, to me, reads like trying to write a character so that they sound smart, but it doesn't sound smart to me. Prose is also something which is important for me. Interesting writing on a line-by-line level keeps me hooked, and I didn't find that in Murder at Spindle Manor in the way that I might have hoped. I do want to say that it has some interesting world building on the side, on the periphery. You get these passing references to a wider world outside them. You know, this Witcher-esque character sent by the government to hunt down, you know, evil creatures. What a great idea. And it doesn't go out of its way to explain it. You know, a lot of fantasy books, every time they introduce a term, they'll give you a paragraph explaining what it means, and they resisted the temptation to do that in this book, which really would not have been served by doing so. The ending was a little touching, but I didn't feel Murder at Spindle Manor was the strongest manifestation of this wonderful idea as it could have been. I do want to caveat this by saying, though, that I'm not a massive Agatha Christie fan. I like kind of very dark, brutal crime stories. I like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, so this was not a book which was built from the ground up for me. It might be for you. You might like kind of cozy murder mysteries, and prose might not be as important for you. And you might just kind of like that charming, a little bit schlocky type of story, in which case this may be more for you. Now, I'm going to sound very negative, and then I'm going to sound very different, because initially I struggled with The Grey Bastards. It tells the story of this clan of half-orcs on the edge of the world, and their kind of conflicts between them and the elves, them and the halflings, them and this human empire. But fundamentally, it's about a leadership struggle within the clan. First thing which got to me is that the prose is bloated in parts. While it is more adult than many of the other books on this list, I felt that maturity was sometimes equated with just being more densely written. Action was often overly focused on describing the minutiae of a fight rather than its flow, and characters would take these actions which were, you know, described in elaborate ways without any sort of like narrative weight for how much that we are describing things. You know, they'd be going through a door and write something like, he threw open the door with force and strode through, taking in this smoky kill and air, but there wouldn't be any narrative weight behind that to kind of justify that amount of words. A lot of good writing is about knowing when to abstract, layers of abstraction, when to describe this much, when to describe this much. And I'm not sure The Grey Bastards mastered this. The first third of the book is also very exposition dense. You know, every time the author introduces you to a new idea, it spends a paragraph or even a whole page kind of explaining it and its history. And I don't hate that inherently, but it does create hurdles to getting into the story, which I struggled with at the start. Now, you might think from that description that I did not enjoy this book, but you would be wrong, because The Grey Bastards is actually my number 3, and it grew more and more compelling the more I read, the more I got over those hurdles. Because a lot of my complaints, let's be honest, can be boiled down to, oh, they could have been more economical with their words. And this is a complaint which, you know, does not bother most people who read in the epic fantasy genre. And it's something which, fundamentally, even on a prose level, I can just move past, right? The story starts with that typical fantasy setup. You know, you've got orcs and elves and humans and halflings, but it gets fresher as you go on, especially because the book is written from the perspective of this orc clan, which feels fully realized. The characters are great and interesting to read about, they're fun and they're different. And you do get invested in that leadership struggle I mentioned. But I know the moment of The Grey Bastards which really turned my mind, changed my mind on this. Because there was a world-building tidbit just in the background, right from the beginning of the story, which I read and I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is every character acting like this makes any sense? And I was irritated by that. Then, halfway through the story, this bigger context is revealed, and I realized that actually, no, I was right to pick up on that. That wasn't a mistake. This was foreshadowing, and it comes out with a really interesting and satisfying answer. I actually remember texting the guy who invited me to be part of this and said, hey, I'm really struggling with this book, and then I got to that part of the message and said, no, I get it now. I get it now. I can absolutely recommend The Grey Bastards to people who like adult fantasy and who want one which is written from a perspective we don't usually get, with a culture which feels different. Rain and Ruin is the first Romantasy book I have ever read, though I did not know it was when I picked it up, but I figured it out when he started kissing up her leg. I do not use Romantasy here as a pejorative. People get into stories through romance the same way that other people get into it through fight scenes. It's just a different lens of enjoyment. Rain and Ruin is a story of parallels. On the one hand, you have these two countries which maybe need to have an alliance if they're going to survive, but their respective courts kind of don't want this alliance. And then on the other, you've got two people, one from each side, who want this alliance to happen. And then you've also got the romance half. So you've got the politics half and the romance half, where those two people begin to grow in their relationship and fall for each other. So there's a parallel between the relationship to the people and the relationship between these two powers. But fundamentally, it is about a queen regent who is stepping into the role after her father basically develops dementia. Only her court is dead set against her ever ascending to the throne, and they will stop at nothing to prevent her from doing so. The writing style, I felt, was actually a step above a lot of the other books in this list, in part because it uses a lot of introspection. This is the ingredient which is missing in a lot of stories, actually, where you feel that emotionally it's just not as hitting as well as it could have. But I will admit that around about the halfway point, it started to irritate me a bit, because I felt like we were getting a single line of dialogue and then we'd always get a paragraph of worrying and thinking and reflecting before we got to move on with the conversation. And the romance side of that meant that it was often taken up by gazing and suppressing feelings and saying, oh, should I be feeling this, and I don't want to feel this, and oh, but I do want to feel this, which I understand was meant to create a sense of yearning, but for me personally, I just am not someone who is drawn to romance that much. It is not a reason that I get engaged in books. It is not something which I find myself choosing books for. So for me, that part of the story got a bit tiring. And that's not to say that it's bad, it's just to say that it's probably not for me. I actually really enjoyed the magic in this book. I found the politicking was maybe a bit lackluster. It's mostly centered on this kind of evil vizier character, the type you've probably seen in other stories. And I was actually more interested in the politics of the other country, which we really don't get to see a lot of in the story, which is implied to kind of be on the verge of rebellion and maybe on collapse, and it's got all these factions vying against each other, and you've got a monarch who is kind of jealous that maybe others are coming for his power and feels unstable, and so he's doing bad things to protect his position. I felt that politics was maybe a bit more compelling, but maybe we get a lot more of that in the sequel. Fundamentally, Rain and Ruin is one of those stories where I go, I absolutely understand why someone else would absolutely adore this story and these characters and this context and those beautiful parallels and symmetry, but it's not necessarily for me, and it's because of that it comes in at number 9. Small Miracles by Olivia Atwater is the only book on this list with the claim to fame as the one to make me cry. I've got it rated at number 4 at the moment, but actually, now that I come to think of it, now that I'm sitting here, I actually think it should be at number 3. It should be above Grey Bastards. It's a cozy fantasy about a fallen angel who is tasked with trying to make the most sinless person in the entire world sin, which is a wonderful idea. Except, of course, there's this bigger game at play between the heavenly and demonic powers. It is funny when it needs to be, it is heartwarming when it needs to be, and it is heartbreaking when it needs to be. It's very Good Omens, if you like that sort of funny relationship between an angel and a demon across the cosmos. There's some beautiful narrative, not quite symmetry, but resonance between, heavenly powers, angels trying to care for humanity, but also allowing us to make our own choices, giving us free will, and then a parental figure desperately trying to connect with this child who feels so distant and doesn't even seem to want a relationship with them, trying to guide them into doing the right thing, but also having to let them live their own life. I love when big, magical, cosmological ideas collide with these deeply human stories, and Olivia Atwater does that perfectly. It's very short, but it is also perfectly as long as it ever needed to be. I especially love the subplot where you've got this fallen angel character rediscovering in themselves the ability to do miracles. You know, it's like rediscovering an old passion. It's rediscovering a part of ourselves that we feel we have lost. Because sometimes we do feel like a fallen angel. We feel like we made one mistake and that we can't come back from that. That we are beyond the pale, when we're never really beyond the pale. If you want a touchingly human story which feels like Good Omens meets Supernatural, then Small Miracles is the one for you. There's a deer.
Hello. Hi. I don't want to scare you, but I need to film a video.
I think the only reason I put it lower than The Grey Bastards is because I felt it was a less complex narrative, and it is, but that doesn't mean it's less meaningful. It's not a measure of its quality. Plus, what is more complex than a parent-child relationship? What is more complex than struggling with how the rest of the world imagines us and how we imagine ourselves? We keep writing about these things over and over, not only because they are infinitely variable, but because, like sailing through the fog, each of us can only ever see a few feet in front of us, and none of us ever truly feel like we know how we're meant to navigate it towards the end. Where Loyalties Lie is Rob J. Hayes' take on Pirates of the Caribbean. It's full of swashbuckling pirates, it's got an evil empire, it's got treasure, it's got adventure, it's got an archipelago, and it's got Captain Jack Sparrow if he wanted to be Pirate King. And I'll just say it, it is fun. It's an adventure romp, in large part because the characters are incredibly driven and they're constantly dragging the plot in new directions, into places which are interesting to go to. And every time I opened this book, I kept on wanting to get back to Captain Drake Morass, because he's the character who really does that. Maybe this is a weakness of it, but is it really a weakness just to say that you have one particularly strong POV? I don't know. The other thing I want to mention is the main female character, Beck, fell a little bit into the old Bond girl trope for me, you know, where she doesn't want the super suave male hero, but he's just that irresistible and she's just that hot. What I will say is the book uses ships, which, you know, is great because fantasy so often neglects ships. Ships were the most important mode of transport for humans for basically all our entire history. People think it's horses. It's not horses, it's ships. And this book makes great use of them. Absolutely fantastic. This is a larger piece of a greater story, so if you're wanting to sign up for that, maybe you would really like this. Now, with all of that said, this comes in at number 8, but I want to remind you that all of these books won their respective years. So, you know, coming in at number 8 doesn't mean it's bad, it just means that it has a lot of good competition. The Thief Who Pulled on Trouble's Braids. This takes the common setup of the scrappy female heroine, throws her into the dark murder mystery and entangles her with darker and greater forces than she could ever imagine. This is one of the books with a bit stronger prose. It's got some nice descriptive pieces, so if you like that, keep that in mind. Amra is a great protagonist, and Holgren is a fantastic complement to her character. He's this wizard dude who is maybe, possibly, definitely dabbling in powers that he probably shouldn't, and in this world, wizards are uber powerful cosmological forces you should not mess with. He's so down to earth and comedic and ordinary, and yet you know that there is something deeply weird going on with this character behind the scenes. I will say I didn't feel that it quite reached the narrative heights which maybe I hoped. I hoped it would kind of go into some of the weirder stuff which it very much hinted at, but I suspect they're going to get more of that in the sequels, you know, the Faustian bargains and the old gods, the eight-folded knife lady or whatever her name is. Now, just as Reign and Ruin was not built for me, I do want to mention that this book does combine a bunch of tropes which I really enjoy. I love criminal underbellies, so all of that stuff worked for me. That might not work for you, even though it comes in at number 6 for me. I originally had it at number 5, but on deeper reflection, I switched it around for Orconomics. I know it feels like a cliche to compare any fantastical satire or comedy to, you know, Terry Pratchett. In fact, I've already done it in this video with Good Omens, but it actually is very accurate when it comes to Orconomics. This is a typical fantasy world where the entire economy is based on adventuring and questing and loot. I kid you not. Adventuring bands going out and slaying monsters and bringing home their hoards of gold and jewels and loot. Except the problem is, the world is running out of monsters and of loot. And so what do the investment firms do? Well, they start to package together the more reliable quests, which are still out there, with the riskier quests, where they don't know how much loot there is and how hard it's going to be. They package them all together, and you can sort of invest in that, props up the economy until, of course, it all comes tumbling down. It is straight up the 2008 financial crisis, and when I read that, I laughed out loud. What a stroke of genius. If you are familiar with D&D, then you will very much recognize the party-adopted goblin who is in Orconomics. This book is for people who want an adventure, who want a laugh, and who maybe do want something a little bit touching towards the end. If the point of a comedy is to make you laugh, then this book succeeded several times over. It's not particularly deep, I wouldn't even say it's particularly groundbreaking, but it is fun, and sometimes all you want is a fun read. The Lost War by Justin Lee Anderson starts out as a pretty typical conventional fantasy before veering off in a more interesting direction. I would characterize it as sort of X-Men meets Lord of the Rings, though I have a feeling the author would very much dispute that definition. The first half of the book was a bit play-by-play, a bit tropey, you know, it's very plot-oriented rather than character-oriented, as in the stuff which is happening on the page is very much determined by just what the characters happen to bump into on their journey. And the characters are, for the most part, in my opinion, they're a bit archetypical, but people do like archetypical characters. It get more interesting as time went on. Usually, and this is a minor spoiler, time travel is very hard to pull off in fantasy. It's one of those tropes, like the multiverse, which have a tendency to just consume the narrative, because everything has to be about it, suddenly. Suddenly you've got to account for it at every turn of the story. But this story actually managed to do it quite well, so kudos for that. I managed to pick the key twist by around halfway through the story, but that is not to say it's a bad twist, it's to say it was well foreshadowed, well set up, and it was interesting when it was finally revealed nonetheless. I will say I didn't feel the writing itself was the strongest. Some of the emotions were written a little bit surface level. You know, you'd have these lines which were, he was so angry and he burned everything. The flames were rising up, raging and surging across the landscape, as much as his anger was inside of him. Which, you know, it's fine, but on a prose level, maybe just not as interesting as it could have been. My main criticism is that I think it ended in the wrong place. It feels like 2/3 of a book. We get this major revelation which should drive the story in a radically new direction, but we just don't really get any follow-through. I felt like the moment it kind of became a bit more interesting, I didn't get to see where that was going. And again, there is a sequel, and maybe you want to commit to that, but as a standalone, I feel like maybe there should have been something towards the end there. So, you know, I think the best way is to say that this is a classic fantasy with a modern twist, but for me, because of the writing style, it does come in at number 7. But tell me, Tim, pray tell me what came in at number 1, and the answer is By Blood, by Salt, by J.L. Oldham, which is very much unlike any of the other books on this list. It isn't high fantasy, there isn't a lot of magic, there isn't a lot of fantastical creatures, there isn't even a lot of fighting or epic battle scenes, and you might be wondering, you know, why? Why is this book so high on the list? And to which I would say, this is a book about a high-ranking military officer in an empire which actively discriminates against him and his culture and his people. He's trying to desperately hold on to this precarious position which he has found himself in, especially as the regiment which he is in charge of is basically being torn apart by the powers that be. Especially because people don't really know that he's in charge, he's sort of like unofficially in charge. And to me, immediately, this is a fascinating kind of position to force a character into. The other thing which immediately stood out to me is that the writing itself was just a lot more mature and subtle and complex and really interesting to read on a line-by-line level. It really keeps you engaged. The other thing that stuck out to me is By Blood, by Salt probably has the best realized world building on this list. You know, The Grey Bastards has this fantastical historical conflict background. You know, Reign of Ruin has a lot of interesting political world building. By Blood, by Salt, though, has a lot of what I like to call mundane world building. It's not nearly as flashy, but, you know, let me read you a passage for when a character asks this guy to teach him their language. When he had asked to teach him the Empire's language, he had asked for something borrowed, pilfered, really, from unsuspecting mouths. She was asking for what was his, kept hidden precariously under his tongue, tasted through ritual and prayer, and almost nothing else. It was not a fair exchange. The relationship someone has with their language and their culture and their way they imagine themselves is really brilliantly captured throughout this book. You know, racism and oppression in the story doesn't feel like kind of a knockoff caricature of, you know, parallel as something in the real world. It feels like an organic, result which grew out of this quite interesting world which they've created for this story. And it doesn't simplify it to, you know, slurs and people being mean, which is what you often see in a lot of, you know, fiction. That this book is not as fantastical, it's not as explosive, it's not as maybe interesting as some of the other stories are, so it may not be for everyone. I want to be very clear about that. It's not necessarily as exciting. It is about a character who is desperately trying to hold on to something which they've built for themselves and cannot bear to lose. This book comes in at number 1, not because it's necessarily the most thrilling book, you know, Sword of Kaigen was thrilling, The Grey Bastards was quite thrilling, but because it's the sort of book that when you finish it, you keep thinking about it, you keep coming back to it. Except, By Blood, by Salt is not my favorite book of 2025. No, that goes to another book, a book which came out of nowhere, which blew me away, which hit me in the side of the skull and left me bleeding out in the gutter for 3 days when it went, bam, you like that, huh? You want more? You think you want this? Yeah, you didn't even see me coming, did you? No, I didn't see it coming. I lied to you. I said this video was about 10 books. It's not. It's because I do this thing sometimes, and I'd encourage you to do the same, where if I see someone just raving about a book, kind of vaguely online, on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, you know, they're just saying, hey, this is the most amazing thing ever, and you should definitely read it. I cannot tell you anything about it. You should just pick it up and you should read it. If I see that, sometimes I will pick it up, especially if it sounds strange or bizarre. I've done this a couple of times, and every time it's been a good choice. I saw someone post about this book just being like, hey, this was weird and amazing, and I cannot even begin to describe what it even is. And that book is J.A.J. Minton's Discovery. The closest that you could probably come to a genre for this book is cosmic horror, but even that doesn't quite fully capture it. What is it about? Well, it is about a submarine which crashes into an underwater ancient city, except it's not really about that. It's about a scientist who is developing a civilization of sentient AIs which are maybe getting us closer to the singularity, except it's not really about that. It's about a journalist who becomes the thing she hated most, except it's not really about that either. It's about a billionaire managing the collapse of human civilization to their advantage, except it's not really about that. It is about gods battling out for the fate of humanity on a cosmological scale. It is about a chess game played across the millennia. It is about Irish history and the Pacific and all sorts of interesting angles of the world. The writing in this book is electric. The characters leap from the page. Every single one is a joy to read. It is mind-blowingly creative, and I absolutely cannot wait for the next chapter. Now, the thing with cosmic horror, and horror in general, is sometimes you risk revealing information and people kind of get like what the creature is and they go, oh, that's it. You know, okay, I guess. But when we got the real reveals in this story, it just made it more interesting, which is wonderful. That's exactly what you want. Of course, the thing with cosmic horror is that you can't really reveal everything, because the point of cosmic horror is that you can't even imagine it, so even if you put it down to the page, you wouldn't be able to communicate it effectively, you know? Now my challenge to you is to pick one of these books to read. Pick the one which sounds best to you, and to help you out, I've created a flowchart, okay? So are you in the mood for something more serious or lighthearted? You're in the mood for something more lighthearted? Well, you can pick between a heartwarming family story, a classic D&D adventure with laughs, or just, you know, a light, cozy murder mystery. You can figure out which one of those three is more you. But okay, maybe no, you don't want that. You want something more serious. Alright, are you in the mood for politics or adventure? You want adventure. Okay, well you can go for kind of a classic fantasy with a modern twist. You can go for Pirates of the Caribbean vibes, or you can go for a dark murder mystery. Okay, but you want politics. Do you like romance? Well, maybe check out, you know, Romantasy and Reign and Ruin. Okay, so you want politics, but you don't really want romance, and you're not really big on, like, mystery. Do you want high fantasy or low fantasy? Low fantasy? Go for the intimate realism of By Blood, by Salt. High fantasy? Well, check out either the orc fantasy of Grey Bastards or Sword of Kaigen, which is Asiatic-inspired fantasy. But maybe you're listening to all of this and you're going, I want something different, something really different to what I've usually read. You want something weird, you want something strange. Well, in that case, go for the wild card. Go for J.J. Minton's Discovery, you know. My challenge to you, you know, go pick out one of those stories. My goodness. Anyways, I love talking about books. I hope you love reading books. Stay nerdy. Merry Christmas. And thank you for being part of the HFM.